I'm Dr. Rosemary Gray. I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, and I've got the honour of opening tonight's event and giving some remarks to introduce our speakers. Before I welcome you all, I think this is a nice opportunity for us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. This is Aboriginal land on which we meet. This is land of the Eora people of the Gadigal Nation, and it continues to be their land even though now we are here in our university. And it's an opportunity for us to acknowledge their culture, to acknowledge their continuing links to the land, and also it's my deep honour to welcome and acknowledge the presence of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who might be in this room tonight, whether they are elders or leaders, or whether they're emerging leaders of those communities. The next thing that I want to do is thank our host for this evening, which is the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre here at the University of Sydney. It's putting on this event for us tonight about Cambodia's human rights record, a long history of abuse. I want to particularly acknowledge its director, Professor Michelle Ford, who's with us tonight. We have some wonderful dignitaries in the room tonight with us. We've got some members of Parliament. We've got Mr. Julian Hill, MP, federal member for Bruce in Victoria, and sitting right next to him is another parliamentarian, state parliamentarian, King Tuck, who's the state member for Clarendon, also in Victoria. We were just chatting before the break about your interest in Cambodia, both because in your case, Mr. Tuck, you are from Cambodia, and as well both of your constituencies whom you represent have a large Cambodian population. We've also got in this room many members of the Cambodian community, as well as other interested people. And I wanted in particular to pay my respect to the members of the esteemed council who are with us tonight. Thank you for being here. So our speakers tonight, we're very lucky to have two experts on Cambodia and its human rights record. Our guest speaker tonight is Elaine Pearson of Human Rights Watch Australia. Elaine is the director of Human Rights Watch Australia, and her knowledge of Cambodia goes back long into her career. Previous to her current position, Elaine Pearson was the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch Asia, which incorporates Cambodia amongst other countries in the Asian region. You might know her name from her publications in popular press, including in The Guardian and The Wall Street Journal, in which she frequently comments on human rights issues, including in Cambodia. Before starting at Human Rights Watch, Elaine was part of the International Labour Organisation, where obviously her work focused in particular on labour rights and workers' rights. And this is a shared interest with Dr. Christy Ward, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. Christy is an expert in human rights and particularly labour rights in Cambodia, and her current research is about the agency and representation of workers in Cambodia. Why, how, and to what effect do they organise collectively in order to better their human rights situation? So it is my pleasure to introduce this conversation between you two, and we look very much forward to your reflections and to the question and answer which Christy will facilitate after. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Well, Elaine, welcome. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us this evening to talk about human rights in Cambodia, and particularly more recent developments that have seen a shrinking of political space for citizens, activists and independent media. Perhaps we could start by talking about the current human rights situation in Cambodia. What have been the major developments in the last 5 years, and where are we now?
Yeah, thanks so much, Christy, and it's great to see so many people here tonight who have an interest in Cambodia. It's really wonderful. I mean, I think, there was some hope that, perhaps what we might see now is a plateauing of human rights violations, that after the election that was rock bottom, that things would somehow get better, and yet things haven't gotten better at all. From our perspective, Cambodia is still engulfed in a human rights crisis. We had, the recent election last year, which effectively turned Cambodia into a one-party state, where, the CNRP, the main opposition party, one leader in recent years has been forced into exile. Another leader remains under de facto house arrest and has a criminal case pending against him for treason related to, innocuous comments that he made right here in Australia. And then it's basically everyone in that party being banned from politics for 5 years. And just this year, we've seen about 150 summonses, court summonses, against CNRP and former CNRP officials, simply, sometimes for just sharing information or posts on social media, pledging their support. And so this is really having a very chilling effect in Cambodia. And it has a chilling effect also because there is no more really independent local media. The TV for a long time has been co-opted by the state, but even radio and newspapers as well have been, completely taken over. So we've seen the Phnom Penh Post, for instance, which previously was an independent newspaper and, quite a vocal critic at times of the government, has been taken over by a Malaysian company with close ties to Hun Sen. We saw the Cambodia Daily shuttered also in recent years. And we have a number of prosecutions. So there's 2 RFA journalists who are being tried at the moment under espionage. They face up to 16 years in prison. Actually, they were meant to have a court hearing last week, but that was postponed. And so this has really sent a chill down the spine of many human rights defenders. And then, of course, there's been attacks on civil society. So in the last 5 years, we've particularly seen the legal architecture of repression basically established in Cambodia, with the law against to basically control non-governmental organisations, with the passing of the trade union law, which also makes it extremely difficult for labour groups to organise, with the number of decrees, with the lèse-majesté law. So with all of this, these sort of legal measures and the fact that there is no independent judiciary in Cambodia, it's actually made it very difficult for human rights defenders to do their work. And obviously, we must remember that it was 3 years ago that Kem Lay, the political analyst, was assassinated. And every year when there have been attempts to try and organise around and to commemorate Kem Lay, even those activists themselves have been detained, have been arrested. So there's just very little space for people in Cambodia really to be able to speak their views and to speak about what is going on politically with the government.
You've touched on the election in 2013, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about that, because that election really shaped the outcome of the most recent election in 2018 and was a major turning point for state citizen and political dynamics in Cambodia. What happened and why have these events been so significant?
Well, I mean, we have to remember, so Hun Sen has been in power now for 34 years. It's a really long time. And so we've seen these cycles of repression, and then where it sort of lets up a little bit. And basically he's become a master at allowing enough sort of space for civil society to be there so that he can get the donor money coming in, so that the international community isn't too outraged, but at the same time sort of suppressing that so that he maintains absolute control. And I think what happened in 2013 is that he was scared that despite his efforts, the election was in no way free or fair, but despite, all the barriers and the obstacles that were in the place of the opposition, they still won, a substantial number of seats. They won 55 seats. And so I think Hun Sen really felt like after that election and the fact that it was followed by mass protests where people came out onto the street, he felt like he wasn't going to leave anything to chance again. And so there was no way that, he was going to allow the opposition to be able to organise. So that is why we then saw sort of, the uptake, I guess, in repression, particularly through the Supreme Court ruling to completely outlaw and eradicate effectively the main opposition party.
And people, I think, have thought that immediately after the election, after there was upswing in repression, that things might calm down a little bit, but that obviously hasn't happened. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's right. And I mean, I think people really thought that would happen. And so, there do tend to be sort of these ebbs and flows. And it's true that post-election, a handful of political prisoners were released. But the repression has continued. And so we've seen trade union leaders being arrested and prosecuted. I was there just in May, quite soon after May Day, and many of the labour organisers talked about their frustrations in how they can't organise even just meetings amongst their members, and how difficult it is with the environment of monitoring and surveillance that they face on a regular basis. And for civil society activists too, many of them, because the Lango is in place, this NGO law, they're actually afraid to take on a whole bunch of topics that are considered, too sensitive or too controversial. And because there hasn't been, enough international condemnation, it's really created, a real sort of stifling of civil society in Cambodia.
We'll come to that international dimension in a moment, because I think it's important to talk about that. We've talked a little bit about national dynamics, and I'd like to talk about regional, because China has become an increasingly influential external actor in Cambodia. And I'm just wondering, what impact has this had on economic development and also on the human rights situation in the country?
Yeah, I mean, China is now, the major player in terms of foreign investment, makes up more than half the foreign investment. For years before, it was Japan and, a number of other countries. But now that, Hun Sen and the Cambodian government have China, they're effectively able to use that as a buffer against the UN, against the US, against the EU, and others who are calling for these reforms. And China's influence, it's very noticeable across the country. I didn't visit Sihanoukville on my most recent trip, but our China researcher actually was there. And, she was quite shocked actually at, the rate of Chinese development across Sihanoukville. Of course, you may have heard that it was reported in the Wall Street Journal that there's potential for a Chinese military base to be developed there. But even the level of hotels, of development, gambling, casinos, and then in other parts of the country, obviously China is involved in a lot of the mass infrastructure projects, roads, dams, and our concern with those projects, again, when it comes to human rights, is that a lot of the safeguards really haven't been in place. So we've seen all sorts of people that have been pushed off their land as a result of these development and infrastructure projects. They haven't been asked, they haven't given their consent, and they haven't received any compensation. And so a lot of these people are really struggling, and they have no way of really standing up for their rights, because anytime they participate in a protest, it's immediately shut down.
So it's certainly clear that the rights landscape in Cambodia has shifted quite considerably since 2013. How have international actors who you mentioned before, how have they responded to these developments?
Well, I mean, it's a range, and I think, part of the problem is there hasn't been concerted pressure on Cambodia coming from the international community. And so I think that's why it's allowed Hun Sen to play off the individual sort of efforts by some countries to try and hold the Cambodian government to account. So look, I mean, the EU has this EBA process underway at the moment. It's the Everything But Arms review of the sort of trade preferences that are provided to Cambodia in certain sectors. It's sugar, garments, and a few others. And that's really about looking at the broader sort of human rights and labour rights landscape and seeing that the Cambodian government has been violating various treaties and conventions, and then saying, if you don't actually address some of those issues, then we're going to withdraw those preferences. It's not actually a sanction, but it's a withdrawal of preferences, which will have, quite a significant impact. The US, meanwhile, has implemented targeted sanctions in the form of travel bans against a whole range of government officials that have been involved in undermining democracy in Cambodia. There's also the Cambodia Democracy Act, which will involve going further than the travel bans, but also looking at asset freezes. And the US government has also withdrawn, a bunch of humanitarian aid that was going to be provided specifically to the government, as well as suspending some military exercises and so on. But then you have other players like the Australian government, where there really hasn't been, much condemnation or real action when you think about everything that's been happening on the human rights landscape. And so while the Australian government has joined a couple of initiatives at the UN, last year there were 2 joint statements led by New Zealand. Australia was one of the countries that signed up to those statements. I think in part because of the refugee deal and the fact that Australia lost quite a bit of leverage because it sent a handful of people to Cambodia from Nauru. It was unwilling to really sort of, embark on the same measures as the US and the EU, and measures, like targeted sanctions that would actually, potentially really affect the situation on the ground.
And where are things at with the refugee deal at the moment?
Well, the refugee deal, I mean, the MOU has actually finished. So there are now 3 people, I think, left, 2 Syrians and 1 Rohingya. A few more people went, but the situation was so bad for them in Cambodia that they ultimately chose to return to their home countries. I met actually with one of the Syrian guys when I was there, and I met his family, and it was a really horrible story. I mean, he's from Syria. He suffered immensely in Syria. He struggled on Nauru. He accepted the deal because he really wanted to be reunited with his family. Eventually, his family came over, but he'd had to pay a lot of money in order to sort of look after his family in Lebanon before they could come back. And now they're living in a basically 1-bedroom flat above the restaurant where he works as a cook. His kids don't go to school, and it's been a complete failure. And, you think the Australian government spent $55 million on this deal, and yet this one Syrian family, doesn't even have enough to send their kids to school or, to look after themselves.
And now that that MOU has ended, what is the barrier to Australia exerting political pressure on the Cambodian government?
Well, Australia tends to like to do its diplomacy quietly, and that wasn't always the way. I think in the past, Australia actually was a lot more forthright on human rights issues, particularly in our region. But now, for whatever reason, the government is putting other interests first, and human rights is there, but they tend to like to discuss things quietly. And I think the Australian government tends to feel like, well, we're part of this region. We need to sort of listen, I guess, to our neighbours and talk to our neighbours about these issues, but they're not willing to sort of do things that will actually jeopardise that relationship. And ultimately, if you're not actually willing to take the steps and to draw a line in the sand and say, these are horrible human rights abuses, you can't go ahead and have an election where the opposition can't participate, then, it makes it very easy for the Hun Sen government to sort of basically dismiss what the EU and the US and other countries are doing. And Australia's not the only one in that boat. I mean, Japan has also been very mild in its criticism of Cambodia. It's hardly said anything. It continued to support the election even after the main opposition party was, barred from participating. And I think, behind all of this with Australia and with Japan, it's also about China's growing influence in the region and a concern about, China's influence, particularly in Cambodia. But the way in which to counter China's rise is not by acting like China and just not addressing human rights violations. I think Australia and Japan and democratic countries have something very different to offer. And it should be about building relationships with the people of those countries, not just the elites and not just with the government.
So clearly some things are being done, some countries and international actors are taking action. What are some other options, some of the creative sanctions or targeted sanctions? Are there other things that international actors could be doing?
Well, I think targeted sanctions is certainly sort of at the top of our list. We would love to see governments like Australia and Japan take concrete measures against individual members of the government that have been involved in human rights abuses or mass corruption. And so these wouldn't be blanket sanctions, they wouldn't affect a whole economic sector, but they would be very targeted at specific individuals. And I think for Australia to do that, it would be quite influential, because we know that a lot of senior members of the Cambodian government do like to come to Australia. They have property here, they have interests here. The asset freezes would really hurt. So, I think that's something that the Australian government really needs to consider. In terms of more immediate things that the Australian government could do, I mean, Australia sits on the Human Rights Council. We put out a letter on Friday urging the Human Rights Council to intensify its scrutiny of Cambodia at this upcoming session. So the Human Rights Council session will open tomorrow, and they will hear they will have a resolution on renewing the mandate of the Special Rapporteur for Cambodia. Now, in the past, there have been some efforts to try and water that down, or even indeed to try and just get rid of that mandate altogether, claiming that the situation in Cambodia is not as bad as other countries that don't have a specific country rapporteur. But the reality is there aren't the checks and balances or domestic scrutiny. So we really need that scrutiny to remain in place by the UN. In fact, if anything, we need more scrutiny from the UN, which is why we're calling for the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights also to have a role in monitoring human rights concerns in the country. So I think that's something that the Australian government could do in Geneva. I think Japan has unfortunately controlled that resolution for a long time, and it hasn't been really helpful in ensuring that it's a very strong human rights focused resolution. So maybe if countries like Australia, New Zealand, other countries in the region that are concerned about what's going on were really prepared to use that resolution and help beef it up, I think that would make a difference.
Even when the international community has exerted a degree of pressure in the past, the Cambodian government has either seemed to brush it off or narrowly evade any real sanctions or consequences. Why is this? Is it by accident, or is it a calculated strategy on the part of the government?
I mean, I think it's hard to say. I don't think it's an accident. I think it's very strategic on the part of Hun Sen. And look, I mean, as I said earlier, he has been in power for a very long time, and he's become very masterful at figuring out what is the extent of repression that the international community will accept and what is it that they won't deal with. I think he's also been aided in that fact by, if you look around the world, there's a lot of horrible atrocities that are being committed right now. Even if you look just in our region, the fact that in the Philippines, you've got crimes against humanity being committed, with thousands of people being killed in the war on drugs. You've got the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. You've got Thailand, which also seems to have taken a leaf out of Cambodia's book and just, dispensed with, gone through the process of having elections, but not meaningful elections. So I think all of that has actually helped Hun Sen, and I think he's also been aided by the fact that he's got China's support, and so China's support has helped him evade scrutiny and helped the Cambodian government really evade proper scrutiny in places like the Human Rights Council, where it would really matter.
And certainly in the past, the threat of the withdrawal of aid has been something that the Cambodian government has responded to, but now China, of course, is the largest bilateral aid donor to Cambodia and has been since 2010.
Well, that's right. I mean, Hun Sen, doesn't really need the West, in many ways, because he's got a lot of the support from China, even the military support, and so on. But I think that Western governments do have something very different to offer. And I mean, if you look at the experiences of Myanmar, for instance, when they were so isolated and there were, a lot of sanctions against Myanmar, they were also forced into this dependent situation with China. And ultimately, even the generals in Myanmar did not like how that felt. I think they became quite uncomfortable with China's sort of dominance. And so they tried to recalibrate that relationship. And I think, whatever the Chinese government, right now seems to be totally publicly backing Hun Sen, but, ultimately, if the EBA process does go through, it's actually Chinese interests that will also be affected. And, looking at the trade war that's going on with the US and China, the reality is, the Chinese investors own quite a lot of these garment factories. Actually, if that goes through, Chinese interests will be hurt. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that develops in the coming months.
So there are ramifications of losing the EBA well beyond the sort of the exports and the tax cuts and the trade preferences.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, it will definitely affect, a number of countries that, are also producing, and it's also the fact that a lot of those raw materials, the sewing machines and, the fabric, a lot of that is brought in also from China. So if that happens, it will have a big impact.
One of the trends across the region is the control of the internet and the control of online media and social media. What's happening in Cambodia at the moment in this space?
Well, this is also an area actually where sort of the new area of repression is happening online. In part it's because the passing of these ministerial decrees that have basically allowed more censorship and blocking of sites that the government doesn't like. But also, what we've noticed is that a number of people are being prosecuted for various either national security violations or lèse-majesté cases for things that they've posted, particularly on Facebook. And so, I think, in part it's because we know that the Cambodian government does have a cybercrime unit, but I also don't think it's necessarily so, systematic as it might be in countries like China or elsewhere. I think it's much more that individuals are reporting other individuals. And so this is happening. And so when I was there in May, we heard of, about 90 cases or so where the police and the authorities are investigating people for comments that they've made online. And I think this is really having a very chilling effect. It's not just human rights defenders and activists. it is in fact also ordinary Cambodians who are sharing, certain stories who are being affected by these decrees and these laws.
Well, I think that's a good opportunity to talk about what's happening among local groups. We talked a lot about pressure from the part of the regional dynamics, but what about pressure within? What are Cambodian civil society groups doing to carve out political space in the current environment?
Well, look, I mean, for the local groups, they're afraid. They're very fearful. I mean, in Cambodia, many of the groups that have been at the forefront of fighting these issues, they've just seen time and again the way in which, Hun Sen has been able to clamp down on space. And so the refrain that I heard, from many different groups that I met when I was there in May is that, we need more international pressure. We need more support from outside because we actually can't speak up on these issues anymore. And I think, amongst the youth, definitely, I mean, there's a whole generation of young people in Cambodia that don't know any different, from having Hun Sen, who's been there for such a long time. There is a bit of a hopelessness there about how do we fix the situation? And I think even if you look at, I mentioned earlier Kemlay's death. I mean, if you look at the way in which people came out on the streets for his funeral, people really want to stand up. But I think, what happened in 2013 and 2014 when those protests were suppressed has made people quite afraid and fearful. And so it's created this kind of paralysis. When you're there in Cambodia, local groups will tell you about all the problems that they are facing. And, they are definitely doing their best in a very repressive, difficult environment. But they're really looking for more support from the international community. And from Australia in particular, I mean, again, I think a very simple thing that the Australian government could do is it could reach out and it could show solidarity a lot more with Cambodian civil society. So that, it's not like the only image that Cambodian people have of the Australian government is the ambassador, chinking champagne glasses with Cambodian officials, but also showing solidarity when people are, being arrested or when people are actually, in court, and actually commenting on those cases a bit more. So we would also like to see the Australian government using its social media channels to speak out when people are wrongfully prosecuted and convicted. And I think that's something that the Australian government could easily do. They do it a bit better in some other countries, but on Cambodia, for whatever reason, I think the strongest statements from the Australian government have really come out of Geneva and, through the Human Rights Council, and that hasn't been supported with strong statements in country. And I think that's a real problem.
Are there other national governments and countries who are supporting civil society in a more active way?
Yeah, the US has actually had to cut a lot of its support to civil society in Cambodia because of all of these issues around, the treason case and the US government supposedly supporting the opposition. So, I mean, in that way, it's even more important actually for the Australian government to support civil society. But, the EU, Sweden, the UK, a number of them have different projects. It's not like Australia doesn't have anything at all. Like, I know that the Australian government's been involved in a fair trials project. So it's definitely interested in some of these issues. But at the end of the day, a fair trials project is going to be useless if we don't actually acknowledge the fact that there's no independent judiciary in Cambodia. And so I think it needs to be combined with a stronger political statement, particularly sort of using opportunities to make it very clear where the Australian government stands and that the Australian government is really uncomfortable about the ways in which, the Cambodian government is repeatedly repressing the rights of its citizens.
So, Elaine, where to from here? What will it take to see real traction on improving human rights and civil and political rights in Cambodia in the next 5 to 10 years?
I don't know. I have to say, based on the current trajectory, things are not looking good. But I think what would really make the difference is if we could get a coalition of governments together to really sort of support human rights and democracy. And, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. A number of countries were so concerned about Cambodia 25 years ago that they had the Paris Peace Accords. And yet, the fact that the Cambodian government is, just deliberately and recklessly completely trashing those accords means that those governments that were involved in that process really need to take action, and they really need to speak out, and they need to do it together. I think ultimately that's what will be most successful. But I think it's really challenging, especially seeing, you know, China's rise and the role that that plays. I mean, I think a lot of governments, you know, feel like, well, even if we do these things, will it make a difference? Because with, you know, Cambodia's got the Chinese government support. But at the end of the day, I mean, I think the question for these governments is, well, you know, you were seeing democracy being completely extinguished in Cambodia. And what did you try and do? Did you actually take steps to try and save it? Or did you just let it go? And so it's about governments actually doing everything that they can to really sort of hold the line. And I think, you know, there's a lot they can do to really sort of show solidarity and support civil society. And given how cowed civil society is, it's really important that those steps are taken. And so, you know, as an immediate priority, I would hope that the upcoming Human Rights Council resolution, that, you know, the mandate is renewed, but that there's some sort of intent, you know, maintained scrutiny on Cambodia at the UN, because I think it's really important.
I think it's important, Elaine, you've alluded to this, I think it's important to mention as well, that in the face of gross human rights violations, land rights activists, labour rights activists are still going out and protesting in the streets. You talked about the coordinated effort in 1991, and that's the point I'd like to come to. What is the degree of coordination among international actors on these issues?
Well, there's very little coordination. I mean, there's been 2 joint statements of the Human Rights Council last year that were led by New Zealand, but there was no, you know, there was the ordinary resolution on the High Commissioner's Office mandate. So the UN still has a Human Rights Office in Cambodia, which is good, but they've been, you know, they've not been super active on these issues. So there's been very poor coordination actually between those countries, and I think it's time actually to really look ahead and sort of see, you know, what can those governments actually do together. And particularly governments like Japan. I think actually if we could really get the Japanese government, you know, Japan, you know, right now seems to be in very much this sort of Cold War mentality, seeing this sort of competition with China and thinking that it needs to act like China in order to maintain its influence in the region. But Japan is also a democracy, and Korea is a democracy. They have a lot of, you know, foreign investment in Cambodia. So I think if the Australian government could sort of use its influence to work with partners in the region that might also be concerned about the trajectory and the way in which Cambodia is going, I think, you know, ultimately that would be successful. But I think it also needs to come with the stick. It also needs to come with targeted sanctions or other measures that would really actually sort of force the Cambodian government to rethink its abuses. And it's not like Hun Sen is suddenly going to, you know, turn into, you know, a human rights protector, but I think it would help hold the ground and prevent a bad situation from getting worse. And at least we could get some improvements in terms of, you know, getting the release of certain people who remain in prison or who still have charges pending against them, and try and reinstate, you know, the political opposition, so that, you know, at least all of those commitments that were made 25 years ago actually have some meaning.
Terrific, thanks Elaine. Well, we might open it up to questions from the audience now. We have a microphone that will travel around, so if you'd like to ask a question, Natalie has the microphone up there. Please raise your hand and the microphone will make its way to you. We have one down.
Good evening, thank you for your comments so far. Having spent the last 27 years working in Cambodia at least 3 to 5 times a year, and having been the UN's former Chief Contract Officer in Hun Sen, I've grown up with contemporary Cambodia. Now, I don't quite know where to begin. Firstly, Australia has been incredibly weak in any public commentary. But we've got to step back further. Even things like Radio Australia, it's all very well putting on neighbours and things like that on air, but it's not getting a message to Cambodian people. The task should be given over to SBS that has all the Cambodian language and cultural skills. So we need to boost Radio Australia or SBS and give them a real role in putting out the daily news from Cambodia in Khmer, and also putting out the democracy message and the concerns of people like Australia, as well as other nations. Then we have the situation which was very well documented by Al Jazeera about the very heavy investment particularly in Victoria, by all the Ochteners and all the other generals and God knows what in Victoria. Many of them have broken Australian law, but they seem to be untouchable. Now, if you or I broke Australian law, ICAC or some other organisation would be after us very fast. Then we got the outreach from Australia. There was a time when Australia was a very generous provider of education.
I might just ask you to come to a question in a moment.
What I'm saying is, we're failing on all fronts.
Elaine, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think there does need to be, you know, it's not just, I think it's important that there are public statements of condemnation, but more than that, it is also about soft power diplomacy. And so I, totally agree that particularly in an environment where local media has become so compromised, there is a real appetite for independent reporting, and I think the Australian government should be looking at ways that they can support it.
You see, we train.
We might just go to the next question just so everyone has an opportunity, but thank you for your comments. Up the back.
Yes, we've knowledge from university. I'm doing 2 projects in Cambodia. One of them actually sort of completed and relevant to the last comment is in consumer rights. So consumer or harmonisation across ASEAN has been a project, a series of projects funded essentially by the Australian government through the ASEAN Secretariat. And I just noticed that Cambodia, the Cambodian government in July agreed to enact a consumer protection law. It's the last one of Brunei to come to enact a general law. And I wonder if that's maybe a potential right spot, because in Thailand it went the other way. Human rights activists migrated into consumer law and have made it quite effective on the ground. It's a developing country in Southeast Asia, but it can also work the other way. So if you could build up consumer rights awareness, civil society engagement, regulatory capacity in that area, maybe there's some hope to, impact on other civil society groups, conceptions of, power balances and so on, political issues. So I'd just be interested in your comments if you know anything about the background to that new draft law.
I mean, consumer protection is not something that we really focus on at Human Rights Watch, so I'm not super familiar with that area. I mean, I will say though that in this environment in Cambodia, it's a rule by law environment. So while there may be certain areas where the government doesn't see that it's feeling so threatened, there may be a bit more space actually to operate, absolutely. But I think as soon as that comes into conflict with the government's interests, or if it's seen as anything that's deemed to be political, which is why the labour rights activists are running into so many problems, that's where we're seeing the suppression and the shutting down of, even workshops and meetings, not to mention, of course, protests and so on. So it is certainly possible that, that could carve out a bit of space for some people, but I'm probably a bit sort of pessimistic, I guess, that, it will help sort of translate into sort of broader space for civil society more generally.
Sorry, here and then Julie.
Hello, I think you mentioned about cutting the international aid. I'm just curious, what difference will it make, between cutting international? I mean, would it be different? Sorry, I'm trying to frame a question. So, is it different if you cut the international aid than overall economic sanction? Because people say economic sanction is going to be detrimental to the community as a whole. So that's why we are proposing for targeted sanctions. So do you think it would make a difference if we cut international aid? Do you get the question?
I think so. So, I mean, I should be absolutely clear. We don't support the cutting of aid that is going to Cambodian civil society or to ordinary groups. I think absolutely that, if anything, it needs to be supported and beefed up precisely because of what's going on right now. But what we do support, I guess, the cutting of is any support that is going directly to the Cambodian government. And I think particularly the partnerships with the military, with the police, I mean, I think these partnerships need to be reviewed, given the role that security forces are also playing in contributing to these abuses. So I think we need to be quite careful in sort of how we think about this, because absolutely, I think you're right. We don't want broad brush economic sanctions. And I should be clear, I mean, on the EBA process, the EU's trade preferences, we don't take a position whether or not that should go ahead or not. That's for the EU to decide. But ultimately, they're making that decision based on human rights grounds. It will have implications for the whole garment sector, and I think there's a range of views inside Cambodia about, how effective that will be. Will it just harm the garment workers' interests even more? And I think, their concerns need to be taken into consideration.
Mm. And already the threat of the withdrawal of EBA has actually put a halt to negotiations around an industry-wide collective bargaining agreement. So even though a decision hasn't been made, there's already been impacts felt. Julia.
Thank you. I'm Julia, a member of the Australian Parliament. I resist any opportunity to give a speech. Hang tag, I just returned from a week in Cambodia, the week before last, meeting with many of the groups that you talked about, and it seems to be worse month by month. The only thing I would say is the context of two questions that I think you summarised it beautifully, and the promise that the international community, including Australia, made to the Cambodian people in 1991 has not been kept. And I will say in our respective parliaments in the coming weeks and months about that. One of the things we heard when we were there was summarised was that Japan at the moment is all carrots, no sticks. The United States is all sticks, no carrots. Australia has no bloody sticks or carrots, but every option on the table, but none of them have come off the table. So with that as context, a couple of questions. Firstly, can you just tell us a little more about what you see, because you've got a nice comparative perspective on the whole region, what you see as Australia's approach in Cambodia as compared to their approach in other countries in the region. You suggested or implied that some countries were doing it a bit better. What does that look like? What kinds of things would that be? Do you have any further theories or ideas about why we seem to be particularly silent in Cambodia? And secondly, do you see any sort of signs of hope publicly or privately to the extent you can observe amongst other ASEAN countries, because it's important wherever we can that it's not just got perceived white countries speaking up, but that we can work with our partners, friends and neighbours in the region to also speak up about this and understand these different politics. That's impressed upon us in many discussions that we had last week. So a couple of questions there. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the ASEAN question, and thank you, Julian, for your long-standing interest in Cambodia and repeatedly sort of standing up for the rights of Cambodian people. I think the ASEAN question is really one that was easy to answer. I mean, there's no pressure coming from any other ASEAN countries, quite frankly. I mean, in fact, we're seeing now that Thailand and Cambodia are sort of almost trading in dissidents now. It was the case quite recently where a Cambodian dissident was returned, was deported. In Cambodia, at least people could leave to other countries in the region and they would feel like they had some measure of safety or protection, or they wouldn't be forced back. But that is actually changing right now. And I think we haven't had any success. We've certainly tried with the Indonesias and the Malaysias and some of the more progressive countries, but I think things are so bad amongst ASEAN members that as bad as Cambodia is, it's not as bad as Myanmar or the Philippines. And even on Myanmar, we haven't been super effective in getting ASEAN to speak up on that. When it comes to Australia, I mean, I think with all of the ASEAN countries, there has been this sort of quiet diplomacy approach and a reluctance to publicly call out the abuses. And I think that's very problematic. On Myanmar, we certainly have seen more of a willingness to speak up, and I think that's come about precisely because the UN had this Commission of Inquiry report, this fact-finding mission report, looking at the Rakhine situation. And so that seemed to give the government a bit more confidence to implement targeted sanctions against some of those generals who were involved in those abuses. But, we get reports every year on Cambodia from the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, from the Special Rapporteur on Cambodia, There's nothing to stop actually the Australian government from taking a much stronger position, you know, feeling the safety of having sort of that UN condemnation behind it. I think the reason why it hasn't come with Cambodia is precisely because there's been other stuff going on, and they haven't really felt the pressure or the need to really sort of, up the ante on Cambodia. And so I think that's something that all of us in this room really need to focus on, is how we can get the Australian government to be more vocal and to be more outspoken on human rights in Cambodia.
Thank you. I'd love to ask if you could elaborate on what is driving the government's repression of human rights in Cambodia. Is it purely self-interested economic strategy on behalf of Hun Sen's government? Is there an ideology behind it? There's been a bit of discussion, for example, of the Rakhine situation in Myanmar, which among other things has kind of a very strong xenophobia or racism towards the Rohingya behind it, so that's one ideology. But what are the interests or ideologies that for you are most strongly driving this downturn in human rights in Cambodia?
I mean, I don't think it's really about ideology. I really think it is about Hun Sen wanting to maintain his grip on the country and retain power at all costs. And I mean, that's clear in all of the speeches that Hun Sen continues to make throughout the country, and the statements that he makes. It really is that simple, and I think it's about not wanting to share power with other certain individuals who've also been players, you know, for a long time. People like Sam Rainsy, Kem Sokha, and so it just comes down to this. But you know, it is having terrible ramifications for the entire country, and you have an elite that has gotten very rich and, you know, has really profited by the status quo, and so they do that. And now the fact that, you know, China is basically supporting the Cambodian government. You know, for China, they just want to have stability. They want to continue to have their sort of investment projects. They want to continue to be able to send, you know, people to Cambodia to work on, you know, these roads, these casinos, these hotels, and so on. And so, you know, you have a support base actually for that, and you have a supporter and a protector in the international community that has also been able to sort of thwart attempts, not that they were even very serious attempts, but, you know, attempts to try and get stronger action at places like the Human Rights Council.
In middle and then down the front. Yes, stability is a terrific thing for foreign direct investment and economic development, even if it has authoritarian tendencies.
So with the with the ultimate demise of Hun Sen, will there be any change?
I mean, it depends what he's replaced with. I mean, I think if Hun Sen, you know, passes tomorrow, I don't know that things will change that much, because, I mean, who knows who the immediate successor will be. Obviously, a lot of people think that it will be one of his sons, but yeah, I don't think it's about a family, certainly, but it's also about this entrenched system of elites. And I don't know if you have other sort of views on this from your work, but I think it's difficult to remove, and I think it's going to take a combination of both domestic and international pressure in order to help make that happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. And there was a question down the front.
Thank you both for giving me this great opportunity to ask the question. As you were stated that people in Cambodia, they're so fearful, they're so afraid to speak up. It's like they're living in the jail with no wall. We are in here, we are fearful as well, but yet we still fight for democracy. We still fight for the right of for our own people. But how much more can we do with our Australian government support and help? So my question is, as Cambodian Australian community, what would you want to see from us to be able to push the government to do more for us and for our people and for our nation?
Thank you very much for that question. And look, I mean, I'm really glad you asked that, because I think the one thing that I didn't really talk about today is also the fact that Hun Sen is not only suppressing dissent inside the country, but is also trying to take that global. And so, you know, we have new foreign interference laws here in Australia that are about stopping the intimidation and harassment of individuals by foreign government agents. And while, of course, you know, a lot of that discussion has really been about China, I think, you know, a lot of those similarities also apply to the Cambodian situation. And I know that there are people here in Australia who also feel at risk, who feel threatened, who feel unable to participate in protests or in events because they don't know who might be monitoring or surveilling those events. They might even feel uncomfortable to come to an event like this. And that should not be happening in Australia right now. So, you know, I think for the Cambodian community in Australia, it's absolutely important to keep raising these concerns with the Australian government and to make it very clear that you want the Australian government to take a stronger position on Cambodia in its bilateral dealings, in, you know, the statements that it makes. I think if we arm Australian officials with the information about the patterns of abuse, you know, individuals who are being arbitrarily arrested, detained, convicted, it helps give more pressure on the government to act. So please, you know, continue to do that. Don't feel, I hope I haven't made people feel too disheartened in this talk. I think there is a real opportunity to try and get the Australian government to do more. We can do that, but we need to have a louder voice on these issues to make them care about what is happening.
So thank you. So thank you for those terrific questions. That brings us to the end of our time. So some really interesting reflections there from Elaine on the shifts in political space in Cambodia, particularly since 2013, and what it might take to get more traction on improving Cambodia's human rights record. Certainly there's a great deal already being done by Cambodian civil society and citizens, both within and outside Australia, but greater pressure from the international community, both bilateral trade and aid partners, is needed. So that concludes our seminar for this evening. Thank you for joining us tonight, and please join me in thanking Elaine Pearson.